They thought my family's 100-year-old homestead was just a decaying relic in the way of their vision, nothing more than a blemish on their blueprint for modern luxury. Armed with forged documents and flanked by bulldozers, they tore down the barn my great-grandfather built with his own hands. "It's for a community dog park," they said, smiling through their teeth, and to keep the neighbors happy, they threw up a park overnight. Fake grass, fancier signs, nothing real about it. But buried beneath that tidy illusion, I uncovered blueprints. Hidden plans for high-end condos, swimming pools, valet drop-offs, everything but truth. What they didn't know was this. My grandfather, Jacob Mercer, had secured the water rights to their entire subdivision decades ago. That spring beneath our soil, it powers every mansion, every marble bathroom, every dripping faucet in Meadow Glen Estates. I warned the HOA president, Leanne Whitmore, a former corporate litigator from New York with designer suits and a smirk you could hear in her voice. Right there at their so-called grand opening, she waved me off, pretended I didn't exist. So I walked to the old pump house, turned a hidden vow my grandfather had once shown me as a boy, and within hours, 200 luxury homes went bone dry. Would you have the courage to shut off a neighborhood's water supply? To reclaim your stolen legacy? My name is Calvin Mercer, 56 years old, and the Mercer family has worked this land outside Hollow Creek, Missouri, since 1891. My great-grandfather, Elijah Mercer, bought this soil with gold coins he saved from mining coal in Appalachia. He chose the spot not just for its beauty, but for its promise, a deep natural spring in rich black soil, perfect for the sustainable farming practices he learned from the old world, perfect to build something lasting. But Elijah wasn't just a farmer. He was a visionary. During the Dust Bowl, when others watched their fields turn to ash, he partnered with engineers from the state university. Together, they designed a self-sustaining irrigation system, one that didn't just nourish our land, but supported neighboring farms through decades of drought. Every penny our family made for 3 straight years went into building that system. And Elijah made sure of one thing, that our rights to the water were protected, not just by fences or handshake deals, but by ironclad legal documents, certified, stamped, filed with the county and the state. They didn't just protect crops. They protected generations. What the HOA didn't realize is that beneath their perfectly paved cul-de-sacs and granite countertops, they were drinking from our well. For 2 decades, we coexisted peacefully. My wife, Janine, and I ran Mercer Acres just like my parents did before us, supplying organic produce to local schools, food banks, and the weekend farmers market. Our 3 kids learned to plant by moonlight, harvest by hand, and live by principle. But all of that changed the moment Clarissa Montgomery rolled into Meadow Bend Estates like she was royalty arriving at court. A 58-year-old retired corporate lawyer from California, Clarissa didn't waste time. With her icy blonde hair, designer shawls, and a permanent scent of eucalyptus and litigation, she maneuvered her way into the HOA presidency within 2 months of moving in. And the moment she had a gavel in her hand, her mission became clear. Eliminate the eyesore next door. That eyesore was my family's legacy. Every Monday, like clockwork, her letters came, printed on thick ivory paper, embossed with the HOA seal like it was a constitution. My great-grandfather's silo was now an unauthorized vertical structure. The historic red barn, once featured in a travel magazine, did not conform to community aesthetics. Even our roosters, who crowed on that land since Roosevelt was president, were suddenly a public nuisance. I called the county. They laughed. My land was exempt, protected under agreements signed and sealed before Meadow Bend ever poured its first foundation. But Clarissa didn't care about legality. She cared about control. I still believed in civility back then. Thought maybe Clarissa just didn't understand what the farm meant to this town, what it meant to me. So I invited her out, tried to show her the truth behind the fences. The rows of school kids from Brookfield Elementary planting pumpkins with dirt under their nails and laughter in the air. The veterans group tending our lavender beds, their hands finally steady after years of war. This farm wasn't just land. It was healing. It was history. Clarissa arrived in a white Tesla and 3-inch heels, flanked by 2 HOA board members dressed like backup dancers in a country club infomercial. She didn't ask questions. Didn't look once at the plaques on the barn or the photos of 5 generations smiling through hard times. She just clicked photos of weathered fences and rusted tractor parts, muttering blight. Under her breath, like it was a spell, she wrinkled her nose at the compost heap, gasped theatrically when a harmless garden snake slithered through the grass. "This isn't personal, Mr. Mercer," she said, her voice smooth as honey over a blade. "We're just upholding standards. Meadowbend residents paid for luxury, not to live next to this agricultural nostalgia." The next day, her old law partner, Randall Price, knocked on my door with a smile so fake it made my cattle uneasy. He offered $800,000 for land easily worth triple. When I refused, the smile vanished. "You might want to reconsider," he warned, eyes narrowing. "Progress has a way of clearing obstacles." It started with the letters, always arriving on Mondays. Cream-colored envelopes with the HOA's gold emblem, like they were royalty delivering decrees. Each one accused me of something more absurd than the last. Violation: historic silo exceeds height restrictions. Violation: red barn out of step with community aesthetic. Violation: rooster noise levels. That rooster had been crowing since the Roosevelt administration. I called the county zoning board. They confirmed what I already knew. My farm was outside the HOA's jurisdiction. Had been since the 1990s. The agreements were ironclad, signed by the original developers. Clarissa had no legal claim. We sent a cease and desist, bought ourselves 3 weeks of peace. Then came the stakes. Unmarked survey flags appeared along my eastern boundary, right where my heirloom tomatoes grew. 5 restaurants relied on those crops. It was no longer intimidation. It was preparation. April 17 started like any other spring Tuesday. I was making a produce delivery to Jefferson Elementary, kids waving from a playground as I pulled up with crates of lettuce and carrots. Then my phone rang. Martha's voice trembled on the line. "Thomas, they've got bulldozers at the fence line. They're tearing it down." I dropped the delivery, tires screeching on gravel as I raced back in the old Ford. My hands were shaking on the wheel. My heart wasn't just pounding, it was howling. By the time I arrived, it was already too late. As I pulled into the driveway, my breath caught. The oak post that had marked our boundary for over 100 years lay broken, splintered across the soil like bones. 2 yellow Caterpillar bulldozers crawled toward my barn, my great-grandfather's barn, the one he built by hand during the Great Depression using timber he'd milled from our own forest. Inside, that barn was more than wood and nails. It held our heritage seed collection, our vintage John Deere tractor, and tools passed through 4 generations of hands calloused by honest labor. A crowd had gathered. Some Meadowbrook residents watched with confusion, even horror. Others smiled, nodded, as if they were proud to watch history fall. Behind the yellow tape stood Clarissa Whitmore, flanked by 2 uniformed deputies, and holding a leather folio like it was a Magna Carta. She waved it at me as I ran toward the bulldozers. "Stop," I yelled. "This is private property. You don't have jurisdiction." Before I could reach them, I was grabbed hard by one of the officers, Deputy Mark Collins. Later, I'd find out he was Clarissa's brother-in-law. "This is a legal seizure. Old man," he sneered as he twisted my arm behind my back. "You should have taken the offer." I was shoved into the back of a squad car. From behind the glass, helpless, I watched it happen. The first board snapped, the first wall collapsed, and then the roof caved in. My grandfather's legacy reduced to rubble. What they didn't know was that we planned for this. Security cameras for them had been discreetly mounted across the property on Bill's advice. They caught everything. The forged documents, Clarissa's smirk, and the moment she leaned over to the bulldozer operator and whispered, "Make sure that ugly old barn's gone. I want an open view for the luxury condos." It was a single sentence, but it would be her undoing. 6 hours after they arrested me, I was released without a single charge, just an arrogant smirk from Deputy Collins as he uncuffed me and said, "Guess we'll see you in court, Farmer." When I returned home, Martha was standing in the kitchen, tears streaking down her face. But it wasn't defeat I saw. It was fury. Neighbors had already gathered, casseroles in hand, voices full of outrage. The so-called seizure notice Clarissa Whitmore had waved around with such confidence? It was a complete forgery. Bill had already confirmed with the county clerk that no such order existed. "This is criminal," Bill snapped, pacing the floor, his jaw clenched. Forgery. Destruction of private property. Abuse of process. Trespassing. She didn't just break HOA rules, she broke the law. That night, he filed an emergency injunction, and we barely slept a wink. Outside our window, the barn silhouette, gone now, left a hollow shadow in the moonlight. It was as if a piece of our family had been ripped away. We made a pot of strong coffee, then laid out every document we had on the kitchen table. Property deeds, land surveys, water rights charters, development agreements, all of it. My family's history, written in ink and grit, stretching back 5 generations. The next morning, we stood in the county courthouse. Across from us, Clarissa's lawyer, smug and self-assured. At the bench, Judge Walter Phillips, silver-haired and suntanned, a man we'd later discover spent weekends golfing with Clarissa's husband at Meadow Pines Country Club. Their legal argument? That my land had been absorbed into Meadowbrook Estates through adverse possession. They didn't expect what came next. I walked up to the judge's bench and placed 3 yellowed, brittle papers in front of him. The first, the 1887 deed signed by my great-grandfather, the same man who bought this land with gold coins earned from coal mining in Pennsylvania. The second, a 1912 water rights certificate, complete with a state seal, affirming my grandfather's exclusive rights to the aquifer. And the third, a 1994 development agreement, signed and filed with the county, explicitly stating that my land would forever remain independent of any homeowners association. Judge Phillips barely had time to glance over them before Bill pressed play on the security footage. The courtroom grew quiet as Clarissa's voice echoed through the speakers. "Make sure you take out that hideous barn completely. We need clear views for the luxury condos." Her smile faded in the video as her true intentions unraveled, plain undeniable. The judge shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. His gavel came down faster than expected. "A temporary injunction is granted," he declared. "All development is to stop immediately. Ownership of the land will be determined at trial 3 months from now." It wasn't the win we wanted. Not yet. But later that night, as we pored over old files at the kitchen table, Bill found something buried in a 1912 water charter. His finger landed on a clause that made his eyes widen. "Frank," he said slowly, "this changes everything." The clause was buried beneath layers of dense legal jargon, written in the looping, old-world cursive of my grandfather's hand. It stated that the Hardrove family retained exclusive control over the aquifer and irrigation system beneath our land, and more importantly, that we granted conditional easements to surrounding properties for residential use. The condition? That agricultural operations on the originating land be respected, and that no structure or development interfere with farm activity. If violated, the rights holder could terminate water access with 30 days written notice. No approval required, no court order needed. Bill leaned back in his chair, stunned. "Frank, your grandfather didn't just build a water system. He built a legal fortress." I stared at the parchment in disbelief. All those times my grandfather took me down into the pump house, pointing at valves and levers, warning me to remember what's ours. I finally understood. He wasn't just teaching me about plumbing. He was teaching me about power. When Meadowbrook Estates was developed, the builders had tapped into our water system to save money, connecting their entire subdivision to the Hardrove supply rather than extending municipal lines. It had been cheaper, faster. And now, thanks to their recklessness, it was their fatal mistake. The next morning, Bill filed a discovery motion demanding all correspondence between the HOA board and Skyline developers. What we got back was worse than I imagined. Email chains revealed the full scope of Clarissa's plan. The dog park was a ruse. Phase 1 of Whitmore Heights, a luxury condo development, complete with a clubhouse and infinity pool, all on what used to be my heirloom tomato field. In one particularly damning email, Clarissa had written, "Once we secure the land, we'll force renegotiation of the water rights, or get the county to condemn them through eminent domain. Bill gave me a knowing smile as he flipped through the pages. She just buried herself, Frank. All we have to do is twist a valve. As court proceedings lumbered forward at a crawl, Clarissa Whitmore carried on as if her victory were inevitable. Construction crews installed wrought iron fencing around the so-called dog park. Teak benches, decorative lampposts, and polished dogway stations popped up overnight. Glossy flyers began circulating, announcing the grand opening of Whitmore Park, a premier community amenity, scheduled for the end of the month. To the untrained eye, it looked like Meadowbrook was thriving, but to me, it looked like the calm before the storm. While Clarissa played at celebration, I met with Patricia Kazan, one of the state's most respected water rights attorneys. After reviewing the documents my grandfather had signed over a century ago, her verdict was immediate and clear. Frank, these are among the strongest water rights I've seen in my 30-year career. Your grandfather knew exactly what he was doing. She pointed to the easement clause with satisfaction. You're not just within your rights to cut them off. You're practically obligated to do so, given the breach. Following her advice, I drafted the official 30-day notice of termination, citing destruction of agricultural structures and violation of boundary conditions. We filed it with the County Water Authority and delivered physical copies to each HOA board member and all 200 homes in Meadowbrook Estates. Some residents slammed the door in our faces. Others stared in disbelief. A handful, mostly longtime homeowners who remembered the original agreements, expressed quiet support. Clarissa, of course, laughed it off. Empty threats from a bitter old farmer, she told the board in an emergency meeting. He can't possibly shut off water to a neighborhood this size. The county will step in. She twirled her diamond bracelet as she said it, unaware that the same water engineer who once worked under my grandfather had already confirmed our rights were rock solid and entirely unassailable. Day 31 arrived. It was a picture-perfect Saturday morning, with families gathering at the newly minted Whitmore Park for its grand opening. Red ribbons were cut. Kids giggled as they ran through agility tunnels with their dogs. Residents snapped photos in front of the welcome sign. Clarissa stood near the water fountain in a powder blue business suit, clipboard in hand, reveling in what she thought was a PR triumph. I dressed in my work overalls and straw hat. No theatrics, just a uniform of a man who'd worked this land for decades. In one hand, I carried the original documentation of my family's water rights. In the other, I held the final copy of the termination notice. I walked straight into the park, locking eyes with Clarissa as neighbors turned to see what was unfolding. She tried to maintain her poise. "Mr. Hardrove," she said with that signature, disingenuous smile, "we've already been over this. This is now community land." I held up the documents. "This," I said, voice calm but firm, "is still my land. You built this dog park illegally. And those condos you're secretly planning, they're never going to happen." She blinked. "I don't know what you're talking about." "You sure?" I turned to the gathering crowd. "Do you know that your HOA president forged documents to seize this land? That she's planning to bulldoze this very park to make room for luxury condos?" The tension rippled like a wave. Murmurs, raised eyebrows, phones coming out, neighbors stepping closer, uncertain but interested. "You'll regret this," Clarissa hissed, eyes darting toward the growing crowd. "No," I said, stepping back. "You will. You have until sundown to recognize my property rights. Otherwise, every mansion in Meadowbrook will be without water by sunrise." Then I turned and walked away. I didn't need to yell. I didn't need theatrics. All I needed was truth and an old valve waiting at the edge of my land. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridge and cast long golden shadows across the fields, Martha and I made our way to the old pump house. It was a small stone structure my grandfather had built with his own hands during the Great Depression. Inside, everything was just as he had left it. Thick valve wheels, rusted but strong, levers marked with fading labels, and the heartbeat of the irrigation system he had engineered nearly a century ago. We stood silently for a moment, the gravity of what we were about to do pressing down on us. Martha set up the camera for documentation. I placed my hand on the main valve, its cool metal worn smooth by generations. I turned it slowly, deliberately, rerouting the water supply from the residential lines to the agricultural reservoir that fed our fields. It wasn't dramatic at first. Faucets still ran with residual pressure, toilets flush with what was already in the tanks. But by mid-afternoon, automatic sprinkler systems began sputtering to a halt. By 4 o'clock, families returning home from errands discovered their upstairs sinks had run dry. By 6, as Clarissa raised a glass of champagne to toast a grand opening, her phone buzzed repeatedly with frantic messages. No water. What's happening? Toilets won't flush. Is the water main broken? The celebration unraveled in real time. Residents packed up, confused and irritated, hurrying home to check their taps. Some blamed the county. Others, already suspicious, remember my warning. And then, right on cue, emergency vehicles pulled into our driveway. Not police, but utility trucks, followed closely by news vans. The County Water Authority engineer reviewed the paperwork I provided and, standing before the cameras and an anxious crowd, made official. Mr. Hardrove is within his legal rights. The easements were conditional, and those conditions were violated. At 8 p.m., my phone rang. Clarissa's voice was no longer smug. It was sharp, shrill, laced with panic. Turn the water back on. This is illegal. Actually, I replied, cool as a mountain stream. It's perfectly legal. Your board broke the terms of the easement. You have my conditions. Full restoration of my land. Financial compensation for damages. And a legally binding acknowledgement that Meadowbrook Estates has no jurisdiction over my property. Until then, I'd recommend bottled water. By dawn, Meadowbrook Estates was in full-blown crisis. The once pristine lawns that residents prided themselves on were already wilting under the early summer sun. Swimming pools stood still and murky, their filtration systems rendered useless. Toilets wouldn't flush. Dishwashers clicked on, then groaned to a stop. Coffee makers refused to drip. The silence of empty pipes was deafening. But the silence didn't last long. Within hours, furious voices echoed through the cul-de-sacs. Instead of uniting against me, the community's frustration turned inward, aimed directly at the HOA board. Clarissa had underestimated how quickly suburban comfort could turn to outrage when water, the invisible lifeline, was cut off. Jim and Eleanor Peterson, two of the longest-standing residents and among the few who had always supported the farm, took the lead. They organized an emergency community meeting, one without the HOA board. Flyers were printed, emails blasted, and by that evening, the Meadowbrook Community Center was standing room only. Nearly every household showed up, and all eyes turned to me when I stepped to front. I hadn't come to gloat. I wore my everyday farm clothes, clean but worn, soil still in the creases of my hands. Not a man seeking revenge, but a man standing for what was right. I spoke plainly. I shared copies of the forged documents Clarissa had used to seize my land. I showed them the blueprints for the dog park, which in reality was the first phase of a luxury condo complex. I played the footage of bulldozers reducing my family barn to splinters, and her voice, clear as a bell, saying, "Make sure we get clear views for the condos." The most damning revelation came when I explained that their own HOA dues had funded this entire illegal operation. You didn't just lose water, I said gently. You may be held liable for the damages caused to my land. And all of it could have been avoided. The room fell into stunned silence. Then a wave of murmurs. Then applause. The next morning, Clarissa tried to do damage control, but it was far too late. Residents began organizing a formal petition to dissolve the current HOA board entirely. The petition gained momentum like wildfire. By the end of day 3 without water, over 85% of Meadowbrook Estates had signed it. Lawn signs appeared overnight. Save Hollow Creek Farm, Truth Over Power, and Restore Our Water, Restore Our Honor. Meanwhile, local media picked up Sarah Chan's expose. It aired across evening news broadcasts. complete with footage of Clarissa giving orders to the bulldozer operators and documents linking her husband to a $250,000 stock windfall from Skyline developers. Just 3 days before the demolition, residents were livid. Some demanded criminal charges. Others simply wanted their lives back. On day 5, the county convened an emergency mediation session, led by Judge Elena Ramirez, a sharp-minded mediator with a reputation for cutting through political noise. The courtroom was packed. Residents wore "Save Hollow Creek" buttons. Clarissa arrived flanked by her attorneys, defiant but visibly fraying. I came alone, carrying my folder of documents. Same as always. Judge Ramirez opened with a stern tone. "In 30 years on the bench," she began, "I've rarely seen a clearer case of property rights violation and abuse of authority." She turned to Clarissa. "As a licensed attorney, Mrs. Whitmore, you should know the gravity of forging legal documents and orchestrating unauthorized seizures." Then, turning to me, her tone softened. "Mr. Harper, your water rights are valid. Your documents are sound, and your actions, however disruptive, were entirely lawful given the violations of your easement terms." The crowd erupted in quiet, emotional applause. The judge paused, then concluded firmly, "This court strongly advises immediate settlement before criminal proceedings advance." Clarissa's attorneys whispered hurriedly. Seconds later, they nodded in surrender. The emergency board, recently elected by an overwhelming majority of residents, immediately accepted my terms without hesitation. They agreed to full restoration of my farm, including rebuilding the historic barn to its original specifications, compensation for all damages, and a legally binding document permanently exempting Hollow Creek Farm from HOA jurisdiction. As part of the agreement, Judge Ramirez added a clause that no development could occur within 100 feet of my property boundaries, creating a protective buffer zone for generations to come. True to my word, I turned the water back on the moment the documents were signed. Standing beside the old Riverstone pump house, I reopened the main valve. Minutes later, the sprinkler heads hissed back to life across the subdivision. Faucets flowed again, and residents cheered from their driveways. The crisis had ended, but the transformation was just beginning. Clarissa Whitmore resigned in disgrace and quietly put her home up for sale within the week. The district attorney opened an investigation into the forged documents and developer collusion. Her law license was suspended pending criminal charges. Skyline developers pulled out of their plans entirely once the scandal broke. Their attempt to quietly seize and commercialize farmland had backfired so publicly, they became a cautionary tale across the state. But the most remarkable change wasn't just legal, it was human. The new HOA board, led by Jim Peterson, embraced Hollow Creek Farm as a cornerstone of the community rather than a blemish to erase. Volunteers helped replant the acre of damaged heirloom crops. Local craftspeople joined in rebuilding the barn using traditional techniques, carefully recreating every hand-hewn beam and weathered cupola that once made it a local landmark. They didn't stop there. A small educational center was added to the barn's second level, where students from a nearby school could come learn about regenerative agriculture, sustainable practices, and a legacy of stewardship passed through my family. Once a battle line, the farm had become a bridge. Our monthly farm-to-fork dinners, hosted beneath hanging lights strung across the barn rafters, drew crowds not only from Meadowbrook but neighboring developments. Families who once knew nothing about how their food was grown now pulled carrots from the ground with their children and listened to stories passed down from my grandfather. The community that once tried to erase my farm had, in saving it, rediscovered something vital. The final chapter came with new legislation passed in the state Senate, drafted in response to the scandal. The Harper Act, they called it, a law protecting historic agricultural land from encroachment by private entities and reinforcing water rights for farmers across the state. I stood on the steps of the Capitol when the governor signed it into law, surrounded by neighbors who had once seen me as an obstacle, but now stood beside me as allies. Sometimes the rights that matter most aren't just written in law books. They're etched in callous hands, in cracked leather boots, in handwritten deeds tucked away in old cedar boxes. They endure, quietly, until one day, when the dust kicks up and someone needs to remember who built this land in the first place. They tried to bulldoze a legacy, and instead, they unearthed a movement. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and tell us, would you have turned the valve?